he was doing the publications design here. I know you doing the publications design. So you were doing what? Yeah. He's nice. He's great. I mean, when I saw him, I thought, what strange is this? But actually, he's not strange. You know, he's really easy. You know, he looks strange, but he's not. There's a look. There's definitely a look.
Okay.
Hello, Shumon.
I think we're going to start. Thanks, everyone. Welcome to an evening with Peter Saville. And
Sounds fun.
it sounds fun. My name's Shumon Basar. I'm directing the curatorial and cultural practices here at the AA. It gives me great pleasure to welcome Peter here to the school, I believe for the first time as a speaker, is that right?
I think so. I've been before, but a long time, I mean, seriously a long time ago. I mean, like, you know, sometime in the 80s, I did some posters.
Really?
Yeah. My friend Peter Davidson, who was sort of part-time teaching here, he asked me to do some posters, I think probably for a series of talks or something. And I think I came by then.
Did they happen?
Yeah, well, the poster happened. I don't know if the talk did, but the poster did.
It's the most
There were three of
important.
them. They're probably in the archives somewhere.
We should
fish
those
them
out.
They're quite nice, actually.
If you do say so yourself.
Well, no, I mean, some old things you kind of think, no, best left in the drawer.
Yeah.
But I seem to remember those ones being quite nice.
Do you remember anything else about the school at that point, or did you just sort of run in and run out?
No, it's just that it's a funny, because the Peter Davidson and a friend called Ken Kennedy, who were Australian architectural graduates, came to Europe on a kind of grand tour, and ended up becoming quite close with David Chipperfield. So I met David through them, and I think David had some connections with the school in those days. So it was sort of, the AA was something I kind of knew about, but without really having any, you know, kind of real connection.
Yeah.
But it's one of those things I knew about through other people. I'm trying to figure out how to talk into this and look at you.
Yeah, we'll settle in. I'm not gonna actually do a sort of standard biography, because I think the nature of the talk this evening, in one way or another, inextricably will be a kind of biography of Peter Saville. I think maybe two statements I would like to make is that either Peter Saville is a graphic designer or Peter Saville is not a graphic designer. And using a formula that another one of my kind of heroes, Paul Morley, would probably say, the truth is probably on a line halfway between the two.
And whether anyone here is the least bit interested in that particular issue, I mean,
absolutely.
Maybe they're not.
Absolutely. I think the fact that maybe one doesn't necessarily have to be interested in that issue, still be here, and for us to still probably get something out of the conversation.
It's a contemporary issue about art and the applied arts.
Yeah.
So it's, you know.
Exactly. But I think that's actually one of the two reasons I thought it was important to have Peter over here at the AA. One is a purely selfish, sentimental reason, which I think many people of my generation would either readily admit or not admit, which is that I think for people of my generation and maybe just a bit older, and the work that Peter's done in in the words of, I'm just going to read out a quote actually from Miranda Sawyer, who I think puts it really well. What Saville did was to make the ordinary record sleeves posters gorgeous. He believed we should have the best, and since he did it within the surrounds of pop music, everyone's first introduction to art, and the one we're most obsessive about, he hit us early and in the heart. And so that's kind of reason one. He hit me in the heart, and I think he hit a lot of people in the heart at a time when we perhaps couldn't really even process what that might mean, but it hit us. And then the second reason I thought it was important to have him here was, which is to do with a kind of issue of, kind of in a more pragmatic way, practice, discipline, disciplinary expertise, and the notion of maybe being a kind of professional amateur, and using one kind of professional background from which to launch your kind of odyssey, and the sort of strange, convulsive and schizophrenic relationships you might then have with that discipline that you somehow mythically still belong to, but perhaps in all practical terms maybe don't belong to. And in that respect, I think what's kind of interesting is I think Peter Saville has always been on the run. How it's going to work this evening is probably quite shambolic and a bit all over the place. I have had the pleasure and the onerous task, actually, of sort of selecting number of projects and images from what you can only imagine is a pretty considerable archive of work that stretches back to the mid-70s. And I've put these together in a series of kind of clumps, questions, rhetorical themes. And if there's one thing that... I'm going to turn this off 1 minute.
And just whilst he's doing it, I'm just going to say I'm very glad that he's done it, because I can't... I find it really difficult. I find it very difficult to give talks these days. I don't really know. If I know what somebody wants to talk about or hear about or discuss, it's very easy. But if I actually don't know what's of particular interest to people, I don't know where to start anymore, actually. It's confusing.
So which is one of the reasons I've put together some stuff, some of which I think kind of will be obvious why maybe we're talking about these things here in this room, in this school of architecture. And I think other things that probably just pertain to the more general human aspects of us all. And the other thing is that Peter doesn't actually know what I've put together this evening. So whilst the work itself shouldn't necessarily
some of it
be a
will
surprise,
be familiar,
the order and the context in which I'm hoping to sort of set it up might be a surprise.
Yeah, you might be about to give me a terribly hard time.
Yeah, absolutely. We brought you here to shame you,
Well,
Peter.
it's possible.
So I'm just going to kind of kick off straight away, and I'm going to kick off with this.
That's what got the Australians around.
Oh yeah?
That they came and knocked on the door and said, you did an album called Architecture Morality. What did you mean by that? And they mentioned him.
David Watkin.
Yeah, David Watkin.
Yeah. Well, actually, that's the point of my this slide, actually. For those who don't know, the image on the left is the first album, I believe, by a hugely important early 80s electronica band, Orchestral Manoeuvres in the Dark. And the album title, as you can see, is Architecture Morality, which is a sort of mirror of a book that came out 4 years prior to that by David Watkin, which is called Morality and Architecture. And David Watkin is now the chair of art history at the School of Department of Art History at Cambridge. And he's basically this book was a sort of rant tirade against how modernism had got it all wrong, and actually how modernism was a kind of tyrannical credo that exhausted any possibility of tradition and past and so on and so forth. And one of the lines from David Watkin's Morality and Architecture is that it is man, creative, mysterious and unpredictable, who is the proper subject of the historian, not the subterranean collective urges of the spirit or the age of the needs of an as yet non-existent society. And I just wonder, Peter, whether when OMD came to you with this title, how much you knew?
They didn't. Trouble is, I gave them the title.
Mm-hmm.
I'll defer the blame to somebody called Martha Ladley. Martha, my girlfriend at the time, mentioned the phrase, or had read a review of David's book or something. I mean, we are back in 81.
Yeah.
Okay, so I can plead loss of recollection on it. The term, and actually I think Martha mentioned it to me, and I misremembered. It stuck in my mind as architecture morality.
Mm-hmm.
And somehow we mentioned that to Andy McCluskey of Orchestral Manoeuvres.
Mm-hmm.
And it then became the title of this album. I mean, why it did, I've no idea. He might have even said, if you've got any ideas for a title.
Mm-hmm.
And I mean, that's perhaps actually possibly very likely. He might have said, have you got any ideas for a title? That was the nature of my relationship with some musicians that I worked with, and particularly actually with Andy. And Andy, of all the musicians that I worked with in the 80s, late 70s, early 80s, actually I got on better. I don't want to use the word intellectually, but intellectually I got on better with Andy. Andy was somebody who I could go and have, supper with and a chat. If he hadn't kind of formed OMD with Paul, he would have become a geography teacher. We found that we had a mutual fascination for power stations and particularly Stanlow Oil Refinery in Birkenhead, where his father worked, which inspired one of their songs called Stanlow. And in fact, I'm now doing a project with Andy for FACT in Liverpool. Mm-hmm. We're doing a joint work based on power stations. So actually what we couldn't do 25 years ago, we can now do. So we're filming inside various power stations. There's a kind of way of recording the image. I quite like these things that are moving, but it's actually a stationary image, but it's moving within the frame. And a kind of the non-aesthetic of the industrial. We're filming that, and Andy is kind of creating a sort of a soundscape to go with it, and we're putting it in a space in Liverpool in sometime next year, I think. So Andy and I have had this type of relationship where kind of we would just sort of come up with things together, and the title Architecture Morality came from that.
Did you ever read the book?
No.
And I think that's why I sort of put it up here, because if any of you have read the book, as I say, today David Watkin is the most public apologist for Quinlan Terry and Leon Creer, and has just written a book on Quinlan Terry called Radical Classicism, and in a sense represents one of the most kind of openly neoconservative art historical positions, and is sort of vehemently anti-modern. So what I like, what happened in this cover, is this weird migration.
It is. I mean, it's an entirely modernist.
Yeah, entirely modernist idiom.
In a kind of quaint British modernist way. It's very sort of it's a British Bauhaus. Yes, the colours and the use of the gill type, and that's actually a window in the cover. And the image is behind the window. And there were two images. One was a doorway, and one was a stairwell. And of course we referenced dozens of grand architectural images, and I found them all sort of in a way kind of presumptive. And in the end, it was some photographs from a construction site, and it was in a way the kind of the metaphor of a staircase. And a doorway of no particular type, just a stairway and a door and a doorway that left a certain sort of non-stylistic ambiguity to it, and it's interesting because I think I don't know if it works so well in the book Morality and Architecture, but in the way I remembered it, architecture and morality. That's a kind of an open, it's an open proposition, which I think is quite accessible. Architecture and morality. That there's you feel that that's something that you might be able to think about.
Yeah.
Oh, Christ. That's
What are these, Peter?
That's devilish of you.
What are these?
Well, luckily they've got great provenance. All of those are by a fabulous kind of artisan called Tim Quay of the Brothers Quay.
The Brothers Quay.
Gebruder Quay, as they were in those days. And I don't know how I met Tim. I actually don't know how I met him. Whether he knocked on the door and came... I actually don't know how I met Tim. This is 79, 80. And Tim and Stefan Quay were living in, I don't know, Swiss Cottage or somewhere like that. A kind of crazy Europhiles from, I think, from Boston. They're a little bit older than me. I think they were even old enough to have got caught up in the draft for Vietnam, and they dodged it, claiming they were homosexuals.
Not together, I hope.
Yes, together.
They're twins, by the way.
I think, sort of... I mean, Tim told me that to the question, have you had sexual relations with another man? He said yes, and then said my brother, and was shown the door immediately.
It's a lesson for us all.
And Tim and Stefan, in those days, and in fact, I bumped into Tim in the street one day a year or so ago, still seems very much the same. Tim and Stefan were living in a kind of late 19th century sort of time warp. The way they dress, the way they live, the bicycles they ride, the endless trips to sort of Prague and Budapest. They live in a kind of... They live somewhere in transit in Europe in the late 19th century. And you see that in their work. And Tim enjoyed doing typography and graphic work and had this remarkable sort of... he had this remarkable fluency with a sort of... I don't know, in a way, the kind of European visual codes, and particularly, historic European visual codes, and he came, and he needed to earn money, and he actually came and assisted me doing things that needed to be done in the early 80s when I was at a record label, and I was fascinated by turn-of-the-century imprints, kind of ex libris marks, rubber stamps, engraving stamps, basically the kind of the ephemera of European culture, are kind of, in a way, cultural accessories, and he was forever doing them for the Brothers Quay, who were Quay Frere, Gebruder Quay. I mean, they were everything other than a couple of American boys. And I loved them. He said, would you... And so he did some for me. And Tim made all of those. And, we were... I've freely played with silly names such as League of Artists. And see the little dessin contrôlé and things. There was a lot of that going on.
And the silly, the reason I put this
is a word that would go with that.
But I think this is just a small sample of the various monikers that you've used over the years. No,
these are really playful ones. They're not serious.
No. Later on, there's PSA. There's
Peter Saville Associates was a proper business-like name for a group of people working with me. These were playful ones. These. They are in the same league as that architecture morality sleeve. They work as introductions to other people, and in the case of the record covers, slightly younger people. They work as introductions to something that I was just kind of aspirational about knowing more about as a sort of middle-class boy in the 70s. these are postcards from my own grand tour, and they were postcards to other, to other people.
Peter, can I ask you
Yeah.
to maybe, for those for those people in the audience, maybe you could try your best to define what an art director is,
Great.
and what the relationship might be between the art director and collaboration. Because again, one thing I haven't put together, but the notion of crediting for any of your work is always in itself, I think, a really important part of the project. And I think the care with which things are credited, and it, in a sense, of course, I think for those people who are in the architectural world and who've done architectural projects, this is just, it's par for the course in a way. So could you maybe try and tell us what an art director has been?
I think that, I'm guessing, because it's even before my time, but I think the term art director probably comes from the world of the post-war advertising, and probably America. And all of the visual material was referred to as the art. So the person who books photographers and illustrators in an ad agency is called the art buyer. So in agency culture, the art director would be the person who directs the art. And it is, but it's a pretty loose term, looser use of the word art. But so it's a director of the art. And I always used to kind of like the term art director, because I kind of quite like the idea of directing art. In the kind of playground of pop art and pop design, you can call yourself whatever you want. And Malcolm Garrett and I, when we were at college, were very fond of the term commercial artist. So that was the term for a graphic designer before someone came up with graphic design. And we liked commercial artists. They were the guys who would be painting the new boss's name on the door. And we both really kind of loved that. We liked the men who could put pinstripes down the side of a custom car, by eye and without masking tape. Where it's the sort of kind of hobbyist dimension of teen art, and where you kind of just really admire people who can do something. So we liked commercial artist. I kind of liked art director. And interestingly, Malcolm put commercial artist on his passport, and I put art director. I mean, it's just do what you want, really. It's not a proper job. You can... And I quite like art director still sometimes, because I find designer so specific.
Did you know from the beginning you wanted to collaborate so much, because so much of your work is
it's just
profoundly
necessary. I had the more analytical I am now, or increasingly analytical, when I look back at to myself at the age of 18, 19, 20, 21, the years when I was going to art college and then afterwards, I wasn't clear at all about what I was doing. Certainly not by the standards of which I have to think about things now. I should not have studied graphic design. If I'd known if I'd even known what it meant, I wouldn't have done it. It's very difficult sort of once, kind of 25 years goes by. It's really difficult for, people who kind of know the world now to sort of imagine the world 25 years earlier. Most people, even taxi drivers these days, know what a graphic designer is. But, even 20 years ago, they didn't. 25 years ago, when a taxi driver sort of said, "What you do then, mate?" and you say graphic design, and you say, "What's that then? What's that then?" and you say, "Well, like newspapers and magazines." And, "Oh, yeah." But now there's a graphic designer on soap operas and things, so people know. There was, the UK in the 70s was for average young people. The UK was a cultural wasteland. The knowledge and awareness about things was incredibly limited. I spent 4 years at art college, and I can't remember anyone sort of even mentioning the Bauhaus. The sort of, the kind of the culture as entertainment in every branch of Waterstones was something that was unimaginable 25 years ago and 30 years ago. You actually had to seek these things out. An hour documentary about modernism on BBC would be kind of unimaginable. So one was finding one's own way through this and making some mistakes along the way.
I'm glad you sort of rewound a few years back to the mid-70s, because I just want to maybe get you to say something about Manchester. And we're going to talk more about Manchester and your current relationship to Manchester in a short while. But perhaps I put these images together. On the left, obviously
Is that Moss Side?
On the right is like the Hume Crescent.
Moss Side.
Moss Side. And the Hume Crescents were, at the time, which was about 1971, were the largest. It was the largest social housing project in Europe. Interestingly enough, over 3,000 residents there. And within 2 years, it had become, your classic kind of modern brutalist dystopia. If I'm not incorrect, just up the road was the Russell Club,
which was the West Indian Centre.
Yeah.
I was in those days in Manchester. It's not a place I would have gone unless I had to go. I was terrified of Moss Side. I had been all my life.
It was as bad as we are told to remember it.
It is a bit scary. I mean, but there's parts of London now which are scary. There's parts of Manchester which you definitely wouldn't go to. I mean, it's seriously dangerous in parts of Manchester now. And I mean, those buildings were disaster. They didn't even. I mean, they knocked down back-to-back housing. The kind of Coronation Street back-to-back brick, sort of terraces. They knocked those down and built those. But I think apparently they didn't even clear the land properly between the two construction periods. So before those crescents were rat infested before anybody even moved in. I wonder now about the sort of social what might we call it, the kind of, in a way, a sort of the social agenda of the post-war period, as to whether really the establishment actually really cared, or whether so many of these projects were merely a kind of antidote to socialism.
Mm-hmm. Rather than a manifestation of socialism. Yeah.
Yes, they were sort of, we will have to do something about the common folk, because if we don't, they'll take over. I mean, I feel that we're sort of looking at a more honest version of Britain now than in periods, post-war periods.
And could you say a little bit then how and why factory and the factory night started there, and what was the relationship?
On that kind of social political issue, it's not something that I had any opinions about at all when I was a teenager and a young person. I was sort of, a spoilt, a middle-class boy who grew up in the sort of the stockbroker belt outside of Manchester, and in a business family which took care of me. I didn't have any politics other than the sort of just the kind of familiar politics of kind of home and family, which were probably just conservative. I didn't have an opinion about the world other than what I knew, and that was quite comfortable. It's sort of a political sensibility is something that's come, from my own experience in the last 15 years. So, I mean, it's an interesting juxtaposition, the Crescents and that particular poster. There's a certain, I mean, it's not entirely by chance. I know the meaning of those lines. You know, their derivation is in fact Jan Tischol's Die Neue Typography. But within the aesthetic of Die Neue Typography is, you know, a common aesthetic with functionality in design and architecture. So there is a shared, you know, there's a shared language there. And that poster was deliberately done in sort of NCP car park colours. I sort of wanted it to recede into the fabric of the city. But it's a sort of naive youngster's interpretation of Tischold, combined with a bit of high tech, which is the symbol. The use hearing protection symbol was off a workshop door at the art college. That's interesting.
This is from
My notebook.
Peter's notebook, and it actually refers to your current work in.
I mean, it's odd being. I mean, I've spent the last 2.5 years back in Manchester. Which was a place, you know, I mean, I left Manchester in '79, and I had visited, you know, once or twice, 2 or 3 times a year, you know, since 1979. My parents and then family lived outside of Manchester and then further outside. So I had no need to go to Manchester other than the occasional, you know, kind of meeting with Tony Wilson or New Order or some other thing. So, so I've just had like a, you know, for 25 years, I've had a couple of days a year, if that, in Manchester. And then sort of in 2004, I found myself back in Manchester with a responsibility to the place. And that was very odd. It was really odd, because I found myself sort of wandering, you know, I was walking up Cross Street, one of the main streets in Manchester one day. And it was kind of deja vu. There used to be an Army and Navy store where I would buy clothes when I was at college. And suddenly, I'm creative director of the city, and this is really odd. You know, a quarter century has gone by, and I'm having kind of deja vu of looking for a pair of, you know, canvas shoes, but now I've got this sort of sense of sort of civic responsibility to the whole place, and I had to kind of think about that. It was very odd to get my head around it. It is very peculiar, and that was, and I did my work for Manchester by sitting around in cafes and places and in the car and driving around at night, trying to discover something, and that was one of the notes that I wrote to myself about this notion of brand, the brand of a place. And it's true, there is an expectancy of Manchester.
Perhaps we can hold off in terms of like the details of Manchester just for a minute, because you were also, one of your early moves is to be one of the co-founders of Factory Records, and I wonder whether there are kind of 3 aspects then. Maybe there are more, but are there 3 aspects to the notion of the factory? On the one hand, there's obviously the reference to Andy Warhol's factory. There's
which I didn't like.
Which you didn't like?
Well, in '78 I didn't like it, because in '78 there was this. It was something that the '60s was something that there was this feeling to put a distance between. So, you know, I was kind of thinking of the 1860s, not the 1960s.
Were there alternatives to Factory Records?
No, just
what
Tony
could it
and
have been?
No one meant to do anything. All that happened was that through the punk period of '76, '77, Manchester had numerous clubs and venues where bands played, and because punk unsettled the establishment in the same way that rave culture did in the early 90s. All of the clubs and venues were closed down. You know, noise abatement, neighbours, licensing laws, any excuse at all for the license or the performing license to be withheld from a place to stop this terrible punk rock thing that's going on, and by late 77, there were no venues left in Manchester, and certainly no venues for sort of, you know, young bands, new bands. You know, there was nowhere the size of this for bands to play. So Tony Wilson, as champion of youth culture, and particularly as champion of punk, Tony took it upon himself to go and organise a venue. And so he and his best friend, Alan Erasmus, went and did a deal with the Russell Club to have the Russell Club on a Friday night every 2 weeks. And Tony was on local television in Manchester. He was a current affairs news anchorman for Granada Television. He was like a young Jeremy Paxman, but he also had a late night music program, which was far more progressive than the BBC's late night music program, the Old Grey Whistle Test. Tony had a program called So It Goes. Tony was the first person in broadcasting to invite the Sex Pistols into a studio, and unfortunately they trashed the studio at Granada. And Lord Bernstein, the chairman of Granada, said, "I'm not giving them airtime. They've ruined one of my studios." But subsequently, Tony was the first person to put the New York Dolls, the Iggy Pop, Joy Division. I mean, he actually showed Joy Division on the 6 o'clock news program one night, which is astonishing. I mean, it was called Nationwide, and it was the 6 o'clock weekly news magazine that usually is about the headlines and that there were the ambulance drivers strike, and Tony had Joy Division on, which was wild. So he organised the club. So pretty much as portrayed in 24-Hour Party People, they got a venue. And it's around about the same time I went to see him and said, "I'm in final year at the art college, can I do something for you?" And he said, "We're doing a club, do a poster." That was it.
And then, but I think there's also these two other nuances then to the factory. I mean, there's obviously the sense of Manchester's kind of industrial past, and it's a point in history, isn't it, where Manchester's future, its past and its future are kind of in a grey period.
When the club started, we just thought it would be a few nights, and that would be it. It was a vehicle. It was a kind of platform for groups. There was no intention to start a record company. Even when the first record was released, there was no intention to start a record company. Tony had a full-time job with television. I was just a graduate from college. Alan was a usually out-of-work actor. On what basis would we start a record company? There were independent labels popping up, but they weren't really companies, they were just labels. They were, in the spirit of punk, there was this do-it-yourself kind of culture. So we did something ourselves. There was no idea at all that it would ever go any further than next week. He said to me, "We're going to call it The Factory," and I thought, that's really naff. Because you can't, within the terms of pop culture, you can't get away from the Warhol connotation. If you go to BMW and they say, "Well, we're going to build a new manufacturing plant, we're going to refer to it as a factory," you think, yeah, okay, fine. But if you've got a pop venue, they're going to call it The Factory. It's so Warhol. But, they called it The Factory. I was interested in everything that I didn't know about. So I was interested in everything before the 60s. I was born in 55. I wanted to know about everything that came before. So that's why I was interested in modernism. I was interested in things that weren't within the repertoire of pop. I mean, whilst the room was filling, there was a Roxy compilation playing. Roxy Music were a kind of a doorway for people. They were, I kind of referred to them as the first postmodern band. Roxy Music were a sort of an access point for young people in the 70s to a world beyond the known world of pop. And this very much was the kind of feeling post-60s, that there is more out there than platforms and big hair, and it's our time to learn about it. So it's a kind of, you know, sort of post-war socio-cultural democratization. It's like you have a generation who now want to know about something else, and it's important to realize that you know, young people from sort of working class, middle class backgrounds, they didn't know about other things before because they didn't have any access to them. They might go to a local library or something like that, but there was no common culture. There was one, but not a sort of an aspirational, an educational common culture. And, you know, Roxy were my doorway to, you know, Paris Vogue, or Acapulco. All the things that are completely normal now had to be introduced at some point to young people. And this is the period. So I was interested in the aesthetics of industry, not something that sort of T-Rex did too much about.
But it's also interesting for those who don't know that Tony Wilson is another kind of middle-class, Cambridge-educated,
yes,
English literature sort of provenance guy. And I wonder, there's certainly, you've mentioned this before, there's a middle-class romanticization of the industrial.
Yeah, I mean,
as well,
I was able to be romantic about the industrial because I lived half an hour away in Hale, you know, on kind of leafy avenues in large houses with an acre of garden around it. So I found the city terribly exciting. All the kind of working class kids who were in the bands, that was fucking awful. But I thought it was really sexy. And I think it is that kind of, that sort of frisson of difference that's where things sometimes come from.
Just onto this notion then, by the late 70s of, I mean, I think there's with Joy Division and the early factory releases, there is suddenly this newfound kind of seriousness, indeed even a kind of melancholy that you didn't even necessarily find in Roxy music, and even Malcolm Garrett's work for punk. It was very much, it was a kind of nihilistic, but nevertheless a sort of celebratory nihilism. And there's something that happens in some of these sleeves where things get quite dark. Is that darkness? Where's that darkness coming from?
I mean, some things there's some things we do because we think about it, and there's some other things that we just do because we have a way of doing things. I do have a sort of an instinctively kind of reductive and serious way of doing things. I mean, for example, for the 15 years after that, after Joy Division, I had kind of carte blanche with, I don't know, half a dozen New Order covers. And we always thought we'd do an erotic one. And I was at total liberty to do that. And the eroticism was one of my kind of favourite recreational activities.
Pursuits.
And I could have done whatever I wanted. But it was just silly. I couldn't see the point in it. It would be indulgent and sort of stupid. So I'm sort of probably a bit boring, really. And there is a seriousness. I mean, the period is 78, 79. Punk has been punk and anarchic, and punk has kind of burnt the field, raised the field is the term. And Malcolm and I were at college. We had this burden of responsibility of being degree students, in graphic design. So therefore, the kind of, blackmail letter style of punk was really not much use to us. And we were looking for ways to re-articulate the serious codes of communications design. And the term the new wave started to be coined. And we were interested in rebuilding, a facet of pop culture. And Malcolm started first, and Malcolm's work is very transitional. It is between punk and new wave, and there's a kind of day-glow constructivism going on in Malcolm's work. And because we were at college together, there's a weird feeling when you're at college, you can't do something that's like one of your college friends. It's just like, there's like a kind of exclusion zone around students, because everyone just says, oh, you're just copying him or her, whatever. So the fact that Malcolm had kind of taken sort of Dayglow pop Liszitsky and sort of ring-fenced it, pushed me further on through the kind of key reference book we had, which was Pioneers of Modern Typography. And so I had to go a bit further through the book. And it was further through that book that I found Jan Tischold. But I liked Tischold. There was a sort of supreme, reductive coolness to Tischold. And I liked it. And I thought, it's a bit fucking empty. I mean, people are still having Jamie Reed is still doing stuff for the Pistols, and there's this emptiness. But I do like it. So I went there because I liked it. And, both of these covers are my response to dealing with something that I liked. One was given, the wave pattern was given to me by Joy Division. All bands, first album, they've got everything. They've got the title, they've got the cover, they've got the track notes. They've been waiting years for this. They've got it all sorted out. Second album, they don't even know what it's called. So they gave me a package of elements for Unknown Pleasures. They said they wanted it to be white on the outside and black on the inside, but I kind of changed that. And there were no specifics. It was like, does anybody know what they want? No, we just want these pieces. Okay. Does anybody want the title on the front? Not really. And we all agreed at that time that putting the name of the group on the cover was really kind of naff and vulgar. I mean, and I hated the idea of things looking like record covers. I mean, put the name of the group on the front, it looks like a record cover. And even if you put the title on the front, it looks like a record cover. And there was no company. It's no business. It is not a business. It's just a bunch of people calling themselves Factory Records. No marketing, no advertising, no contract, no investment, no sales force, no distribution. It just doesn't matter. So I just did what I could do with the elements, and that was very, very limited. I mean, I didn't really know anything. I'd only just left college. I mean, computers didn't exist. I wasn't that sure about how you prepared artwork for print. And I could only trust black and white. I had no idea how you did anything in color. And I did the whole thing on what was called a PMT camera, a photomechanical transfer camera. I'd made it look how I could actually make it look. So I was certain. So, that image couldn't really be much bigger than that because the camera wouldn't make it any bigger. So that was as big as... I wanted to see exactly what I was doing. And learned to... By the time we did Closer, I learned a little bit more. And that's how they were done. And when it came to Closer, they had nothing. And they just came round one day. They were at Britannia Row recording the album. Rob Gretton, their manager, brought them over and he said, Peter, you take so fucking long with these things, we better start now. And he said, what have you got? And by this time, this is a year after the beginning of Factory, by this time, the notion that Peter would have something that he wanted to do was beginning to be established within the family. And I did have something I wanted to do, usually. But suddenly Rob brings Joy Division around, and the kind of myth of Joy Division is beginning to grow. And I'm, instead of just being four boys, now they're kind of Joy Division. And I'm not scared of them, but there's a touch of apprehension, 12 months later. It's becoming a thing. They're selling out the Lyceum in 1 hour. And I'm nervous. And he said, have you got anything? And of course, the wave pattern was what they gave me a year before. And I thought, I don't have anything like that. And I said, I don't know, Rob. I mean, what's it called? Don't know. Don't know yet. You know, is there anything to listen to? Don't be stupid. They haven't finished. All right. He said, come on, you've got something. I said, Rob, I don't know. He said, we haven't got time to waste. What have you got? So I said, well, okay, there's one. All right, if push comes to shove, I took Zoom magazine off the shelf and said, I bought this last month. There's some pictures in here which I think are amazing. They won't be of any interest, but you've forced me. So I put them on the table and I walked away, expecting them to say, yeah, nice, but no. And they were entranced. And they had 5 minutes flipping back and through Zoom magazine, and then opened it and said, we want this one. And Rob took them back to the studio. And that was it. And, you know, it came to pass that it was called Closer. That's record covers. I mean, when I heard it after. Unknown Pleasures I heard afterwards. I had no idea how good Unknown Pleasures was going to be. It was a real shock. I heard it the day I delivered the artwork to Rob. He said, I've had a test pressing. Do you want to hear it? And I was like, oh, shit. Because all I'd heard of Joy Division on record was the factory sample, and there were 2 tracks, and they were awful. And suddenly the manager is saying to me, do you want to hear the album? And I'm thinking, fuck, 40 minutes of Joy Division? I thought, but I can't say no because I've just delivered the artwork. It seems terribly, you know, kind of rude. So I said, yeah, okay then. I think, oh, fuck, get the cigarettes out. And, you know, obviously within 10 seconds, what Martin Hannett had done to Joy Division was mind-boggling. And I knew enough of the albums and the music of the new wave to know that by the time we were even halfway through side 1, this was the best album so far of the new wave. And I'm sitting there thinking, fucking hell, I've just done the cover. Shit. Because it was suddenly beyond. Everything to that point had been some posters around Manchester. And yes, we did the factory sample and it sold out, but out of sympathy, I think. And suddenly you're listening to an astonishing... It's like a mate's been building a car in the garage and you go in and it's an Aston Martin or something. You think, fucking hell. There may be... So when you hear a record that is great, I mean, you know it's great. It's like when you hear a hit, you know it. I mean, I saw them play London University and they played Love Will Tear Us Apart. They've got a new song. And the moment you hear it, you know it's a hit. And the whole kind of the perception of the world changes at that point. And Martin Hannett, I mean, I didn't even appreciate Martin at the time. Martin was a genius. Martin made Joy Division. You know, Ian's feelings and Martin made Joy Division.
In a way, this then sets us up for, as you mentioned, you then have a, a very long working relationship with New Order that lasts into the early 90s, perhaps. And
still today. I saw them on Tuesday by accident. They were in Manchester with Anton Corbijn at the screening of Anton's film Control. And he was showing it to Bernard and Hookie for their blessing, and also they're going to do some music for it.
But I read somewhere that you said that the sort of, if you chart the trajectory of the covers, the artwork that you did with New Order, in a sense, what we all see is this is your growing kind of acquisition of knowledge in a way.
It charts my bookshelf, and my bookshelf was my sort of my low budget grand tour. My parents didn't send me to the classical world for a couple of years. I just went and bought lots of books. It started one day at college. when I tried to take Malcolm's copy of Pioneers of Modern Typography, which had come by accident from a mistaken year he spent at Reading University. We didn't have a reading list at the Polytechnic. No one talked about the history of graphic design when I was at college. Malcolm and I, having had been at grammar school together, went to art college together. Malcolm had done science A-levels, I'd done arts. Malcolm had been academic, he'd passed all his A-levels, I hadn't. And he was being pretentious, and he wanted to go to a university to do graphic design, which, you know, we were just naive, it's a stupid idea. And there was only one university in Britain that did a graphics course, and it was Reading University. And Malcolm decided to go there. We didn't know anything about graphics. We were only doing it because our art school teacher told us to. And Malcolm went to Reading, which was a very dry, academic, historically and Swiss-based design course. So Malcolm had a reading list. He left after 12 months, joined me at Manchester, and had more fun. And he plundered his reading list as source material. So I did. I tried to take his copy of Pioneers of Modern Typography. He wouldn't let me. And I said, where am I going to get it? And he said, well, you could try the college library. And I said, where's that? And he said, oh, fuck. He said, it's on Oxford Road. Have you never been? I went, no. And I went, and nobody else had ever been either. They had amazing books, and none of them had ever been taken out. And of course, Pioneers of Modern Typography was there, and many others. I still have their book on Pièces of Art. Nobody had ever taken it out in 7 years, so I thought, well, they won't miss it now. So I kept that one. I sort of, you know, at the library, this is one day in the early third year, so it's the final year. That day, in the library, I realized or saw for the first time the relationship between graphic design and the art of the 20th century. You know, it's bleeding obvious if you see it. But if all you know of art is like pop art and Victorian oil painting, you don't get it. If your college has presumed that nobody is interested in the history of culture, you're not taught it. And when I saw the relationship between communication design, graphic design, and art, it scared me at first. It really scared me. I remember I went and sat in the college refectory with a few of these books on the table in front of me, and I thought, fucking hell. I mean, I'd looked at kind of, you know, I'd been looking at Velvet Underground covers, Roxy Music covers, and sort of like, you know, sex magazines as reference. And suddenly I've got all this like heavy stuff. And I thought, you know, at first like, I'll get my coat. I just thought I don't. But I kind of got over it, and at that point started to acquire information. My education started at the moment that I decided I wanted to learn. And you can go through school, you can go through university, and many people go through that and they never have that moment. They just go through on autopilot. And the moment that you actually want to learn, that you want to know about something, whatever it is, whether it's architecture or skydiving, the moment at which you want to know is the moment at which your kind of life and your development and your growth starts. Nobody has to tell you or cajole you to do anything after that point. It's kind of like, it's difficult to stop. And I spent the next decade trying to learn something about where things came from. And then I spent the next decade trying to figure out where they were going.
I think this is one of the
Best
really
example of
kind
it.
of quintessential examples of that. Because on the one hand, I mean, literally shows this kind of enthrallment on the one hand, you know, with this incredibly gorgeous, sumptuous image by Fontaine-Latour on the left. And then on the top right, and on the back, it's another seemingly another universe, and somehow these two things come together. And when I was sort of about 15 or 16, with my mate Stu, we spent hours in Blackpool.
Oh.
And because that's where we grew up, and we for hours, days, weeks pondered what the hell's going on here, and you just assume, well, it's something arty, isn't it? Something a bit constructivist or I don't know, ism. And then one day my friend says, you know what, Shumon? This is an alphabet, and these are words. And we somehow sat down and spent a good part of an evening cracking it. And the moment we cracked it, it was pure joy. And this basically, I can't remember the number now, but this says fact.
FACT 75.
Yes. And indeed, power, corruption,
lies, new order, blah, blah, blah.
Exactly. And so this wheel basically
is the key.
Is the key. And there are 26.
That's the giveaway.
Yeah?
I mean, it isn't that difficult, but but I mean, no, but it's not. But I mean, but if it's not difficult if you bother. The weird thing is that people bothered. I mean, you and what was your friend?
Stu.
You and Stu missed the fact that the week after the release of Power, Corruption and Lies back in '83, the week after, there were 2 letters in the NME. There were 2 letters pointing out the spelling mistake. The spelling mistake on Power, Corruption and Lies. And it's one of the someone in the studio said, "You've seen the NME? This is a spelling mistake." Fuck off. And they were right. There was a spelling mistake. Corruption, and funnily enough, it was corruption. It wasn't spelt incorrectly. The tints were laid incorrectly by the repro house. And this was fascinating to me. From that point on, I never underestimated or even felt I even comprehended the neurosis of music fans, and particularly New Order, Joy Division fans. The stuff I hear from people, there are entire websites dedicated to, wear that image on the cover of Closer. I don't know any of this stuff. I'm not that interested. I'm not interested in, I'm not obsessively interested in the music. I don't even know the titles of the tracks because some idiot never put them on the record. And it's peculiar, the stuff that people figure out. I mean, I was not obliged to give any information, but I wanted to create that color wheel on the back. And I kind of thought, well, the alphabet will create, it gives you this subdivision of 26. So there's not that many things in the world which subdivide by 26, apart from the Roman alphabet. So if you want to get it, it's there to get.
It's one of those things. It's obvious when you know.
Yes, I had an entirely other reason for doing this. To me, it was about coding. It's 1983, and one of the things that I was interested in was the advent of computer systems, and that painting came from the National Gallery. And I was fascinated back in the early 80s by the notion that archival material, cultural history, was beginning to appear in an entirely new medium of the computer screen. That, obviously if we went to see an archivist in a museum before retrieval systems, if they went to look for a work of art, they probably went, into the storeroom and wandered the shelves until they located it. And I was really fascinated in the early 80s by the fact that they'd come up on screen. And I thought, that's weird. You get, 11th century religious icon, and it's on screen. It's never been on a screen before. And it's on a screen in the context of the language of computer systems. So there's a new juxtaposition which has never existed before, and I was fascinated by that. And I wanted to create a juxtaposition of historicism and coding. But I didn't want to be gratuitous with the coding. I didn't want to just put some pseudo-computery bits on it that were meaningless. But I thought, well, but I don't have any information. There is no... And I thought, well, okay, I do have a title and I do have a catalogue number. I do have the bare essentials of information, which I'll place somewhere. So I thought, how can I make them a code? So I thought, well... So I thought, if I turn the alphabet into a type of code, then I will be able to put real information in coded form on this image and create this juxtaposition. So that's what I did.
Jumping forward 10 years now, 1993, I think.
Yes, that's 10 years.
And so this is Regret by New Order, at which point they've... are we still in Factory? No, we've gone to London.
It's a terrible, terrible period. It's the disintegration of Factory, recrimination, and ironically, a New Order album being released by London Records, which was weirdly ironic. After so long trying to avoid London and staying based in Manchester, they end up signed to someone called London Records. I think it was enough to put Rob Gretton in the grave.
And am I right in thinking that this is the one album, the one cover that they actually...
They like that one.
They really like this one.
They loved that one. Most of the others they either didn't like or didn't mind. We don't... The best I ever got from Rob, I would say, how do they feel about the cover? Because it was normally done when they would see it, and it was in the shops or whatever. And Rob would say, the best he said was, they don't much mind it. So that was all right. Some they hated. Low Life they hated. I Got You Fucking Bastard in loud unison from all of members of the group for doing Low Life. I walked into a room, they saw me and went, and they in unison they shouted "You fucking bastard" at me. Didn't like that one. but anyway, Regret. They go back a minute, because Regret they liked, because it was glossy and sexy and, you know, a whole...
Everything they want.
Yes, sell. Like Bernard said, we might fucking sell something with this one, Peter. How long's it taken? They love that one, and that comes out of my own... That is just relevant at this point, because that is me showing an interest for the first time in real time, in the times in which I am living, and in a way the awfulness of the times I was living in. So this is early 90s. It's a way of seeing the now was shown to me by Richard Prince. I picked up a copy of Spiritual America one day. I was traveling, and I went to someone took me to the Walker in Minneapolis. And I went through the bookshop, as was my duty to go through the bookshop, and I saw Spiritual America. And it showed me the now. It showed me a way of looking at 1990, 89, 90. And in a way, the kind of really naff American now, or then. And I found it interesting. And Regret and Republic, etc., all come from exploring... In a way, it's a parody. It's a sort of celebratory parody of the now. I mean, that's, if you drove through Studio City round about that time, the poster for The Unforgiven, would be 100 foot high on the side of Universal Studios. The type at the top is the Disney home video channel. The logo's done deliberately like a kind of HBO TV movie cheap logo. The whole thing is a kind of slightly sort of home box office. Reduction to entertainment of everything.
And they loved it.
They loved it because it was colourful and shiny. That's all. They just liked it because it was colourful and shiny. They've never asked me about any of them. They've never asked me why or how or what the fuck is that about. They have never, ever, ever asked me why.
He used this term,
and that's why. When Ian died, he left behind the band. And groups are kind of democracies. You know, in the early days, if you have a van, you're in the group. In the early days with groups, they are perfect democracies. It doesn't matter who does what. In fact, if you've got a van, you're more important than a lyricist, actually. So, and groups are kind of lovely at that stage. They're friends. They've been friends for a while. They've suddenly got this moment and this opportunity to do something. And even though they haven't got any money yet or anything, they've got the opportunity. The opportunity is like a wealth. And it's a really nice moment. And it doesn't have to be a group. You know, sometimes when people are starting up a company or whatever, you know, or opening a restaurant or a cafe or something, there's that kind of first 12 months when there's this sort of, it's what we've wanted, and we're not going to fucking argue about stuff at the moment because it's just, this is too good and too important to argue. And, of course, Joy Division, a kind of a political and kind of artistic hierarchy would have crystallized within Joy Division if Ian hadn't died. But Ian died before that happened. You know, Ian was not the leader of the band. Ian sung the songs when he didn't fucking pass out, you know, and let us all down, sort of thing. So he did the singing. That was it. And when Ian, he would have ultimately, of course, he would have become, you know, like Jim Morrison in the Doors or whatever. He would have become Ian, but he died.
Would he have become Bono?
There's probably a there's a witty retort, but I don't know what it is, so I won't make a poor one.
I hope not.
How can you be called Bono? We were joking,
it says it all.
We were joking the other day about him and Yoko and being Bono Ono, which we thought was quite a good name, Bono Ono, or Ono Bono.
Bono.
So that didn't happen. So when Ian died, he left behind the group. And New Order were the band, and they were entirely equal. All members of New Order are equal. You cannot say that any member of New Order, there's lead guitar, bass guitar, and drums, and they are equal. And Rob Gretton was their friend and kind of political spin doctor and manager. And after Ian's death, Rob held New Order together. They did not replace the singer. They just drew lots to see who would do the singing. And they wrote together. When they were doing Power, Corruption, Lies, I visited them at the studio, and it was really charming. On a table in the kind of recreational room where everyone goes to have a drink or watch television or whatever, there was a piece of paper. And there were lyrics on the piece of paper for one of the songs on Power, Corruption, Lies. I don't know the title of the song. And there were three handwritings. Somebody was managing a line or two and give it up and leaving it, and then someone would come and like think, oh yeah, okay, blah, blah, blah. And this is how they were writing songs. At one point in the song, it says no lyrics, because that's probably Hooky just sort of taking the piss and saying, yeah, no fucking lyrics as well. And that's one of the lyrics, no lyrics. And this is how it operated. And as with groups and as with families, they all began to disagree about everything. So there was never an agreement. What happened was what happened if you leave things to chance. So decisions became default decisions. You know, if we don't tell the promoter we're going to do, 2 extra gigs by Friday, then they're off. No one told him, so they were off. So this is how decisions happened. And they just got to a point where they disagreed about everything. So it was pointless to have a discussion because they would disagree on principle. So I asked them once, I had a design for something, it was in black and white, as artwork is, and I said, what colour do you want it? And one of them said, blue. So, good. So then that was like, Bernard said, I want blue. So then Hooky said, red. So, fair enough. So I turned to Stephen and say, as for a solution here, solve this. Give me 2 votes on red or blue. And so Stephen said, green. And Gillian was in the group then, and I said, Gillian, please, should I yellow? And so I said to Rob, he said he thought it looked good in black. And that was it, end of meeting. And I realised that none of them meant what they said. I mean, whoever started it off meant it. And all of the others just said something different, just out of bloody mindedness, to not support one of the others. So that was, and that was the end of the meeting. They went off and they walked out. And I said to Rob, what do I do? And he said, just fucking do it. So that's how things happened. They refused to agree on anything. There was no point me showing them things because there'd be an impasse. So just got on without it.
I mean, I find it an interesting model of democracy. Yeah. I mean, and I think a lot of people here either have or will work as part of groups, and the thing that usually destroys the group is the issue of leadership at some point,
I mean,
and pulling rank.
Yeah. I mean, in the end, New Order became Bernard's band. So when Factory finished, and particularly when Rob Gretton died, they had all had years doing their own solo projects, and reluctantly they had to accept that New Order, certainly their financial interests were best served by being New Order. But the one person who you couldn't be New Order without was the person who became the lyricist and the singer, and that was Bernard. So Peter Hook and Stephen Morris just had to form rank, or whatever the expression is. And New Order are now Bernard Sumner's band. And they are worse for it.
I just want to, we should probably speed on somewhat.
Yeah, we probably have to go home in a minute.
Yeah. So let's move at a brisk pace. Sticking in the early 90s now, and I just want to bring up a very different project, and it's your relationship or your tryst with Yohji and with fashion in general. And it seems to me there are just these 2 examples from 91, I think, for the Yohji campaign. And there's a sense in which, for me, there's a similar sense in which, I mean, again, there's a contrast, I think, between the quality of the image and the sentiment of the text. And often there's a sense in which the sentiment of the text is, again, there's a kind of weird melancholy. There's a sense of the night after the party.
Well, with that one, specifically with that one.
Yeah. That, again, is not something that you're meant to kind of evoke in fashion, in the same way that in the late 70s you're meant to.
I mean, that's it. That's the beginning of my having a political response to the world around me. All of this work is about me expressing how I felt about things, or what I liked, or what I cared about. And graphic design is not that. Communications design is for others to others. That's the job. You are a designer of a communication. So that means somebody else's message to a prescribed audience. That's the job. It's like handwriting. It's the kind of handwriting and the delivery system. It's not the message. Now, that's the thing that I didn't appreciate when I went off and studied graphic design. And it's the thing that I've struggled with for the last decade or so. Factory, this kind of weird autonomy of Factory, allowed me a platform to express myself to other people. Which, of course, the role of the professional graphic designer does not allow that. It's not about that. You can be a product designer, you can be an architect, you can find ways to do your own piece or work. Even if nobody else wants it, fine, you'll get the money, you'll build it. But actually, communications design is the design of communications. So without the communication, there's nothing to design. Unless, of course, you find that you're in a way designing your own communication. So that's actually not really then a communications designer. That actually you're then being an author or an artist or an image maker or whatever. It's not actually communications design. I always wanted to express myself, and as I got older, I wanted to express myself places that mattered. So as I kind of grew out of pop, and as we get certainly into the mid-'80s, fashion begins to become the more preeminent platform of pop culture than music. You know, it's the beginning of the horrible state of affairs that we have now. And I was 30. And I kind of I didn't feel that the record racks and sort of music culture was really kind of, I didn't really belong there anymore. And the opportunity came up to work with Nick Knight and Mark Astley with Yohji, and I did through 86, 87, 88, and then finally Yohji fell out with Mark. And in 1990, Yohji felt distinctly anti-fashion business, and I did as well. And it came to pass that Yohji fired Mark, and I had a show in Tokyo, and somebody showed Yohji what I really did, and Yohji contacted me, and he said, Peter, I want you to do the campaign for a collection. He said, but I am tired. He said, I don't want to see the clothes. I said, I don't want models, I don't want the clothes. And really he was saying, I'm sick of this. And he was completely right. This was the beginning of the recession. I was sick of it. It didn't make sense anymore. It was over. So if you just go back one, it was over. So I made a campaign that said that. And I put a headline. You don't put headlines on fashion campaigns. I mean, the rest of Yohji's company, his distributors, the stockists in America refused to run these ads. They just couldn't. This is 1991 or whatever. They could not believe that somebody was asking for 2 pages in American Vogue and not showing the garments. This is just lunacy. And then I had people on the phone, why game over? Does it mean Yohji is over? And I'm like, well, no, not exactly. But he and I felt exactly the same thing. It was fucked. And I can't believe that it's already been over once and that we now have to have like a decade or so go by for it to be over again. But, you know, that's what I felt. And I kind of, so I used post-pop imagery and a negative sensibility in the type. I mean, it's protect me from what I want. It's I shop, therefore I am. That's all it is. But within the context of the consumer world. And, you know, we did it. And because it's a Japanese company and because Yohji is the chairman, and a Japanese company, everybody does what, you know, the Yohji-san says, they just have to bow and go away and kill themselves, you know. So they did for one season. And then they stopped it. It took 2 seasons to stop it, but they were just, the company was like, this is financial suicide. We have to stop it. We have to stop Peter. We have to stop Yohji. We've got to stop it. So they steered it back round over a couple of seasons to having the clothes again. I mean, and these ads were for the men's collection. This is a parody on This Is Tomorrow, which was the 60s pop art show, so this was tomorrow. And for a men's collection, I thought the kind of failed Stamen was quite good. You bastard.
Slightly more...
we have to pay the rent.
Exactly. So it's not like all your clients necessarily always share your semi-iconoclastic vision. Huh?
See, the funny thing is that's 10, 11 years later. So that thing for Yohji is 90, 91, 92, which is the recession. Then the world comes out of recession and creates the fucking nonsense of now. And to be honest, professionally and economically, completely adrift. I end the recession at Pentagram, saved from drowning by Pentagram. I had a studio, we never worked profitably. Profitability as a discipline was not in the studio. We would be being paid enough for a day and we'd spend a week. It was crazy. And I kept on hoping that because everything we were doing was so kind of preemptive and predictive of the way that the kind of cultural economy or culturalized economy was going, I was certain that one day, business will wander in and say, you are veritable geniuses. How much do you, here's 50 grand for your debts, come join us. Well, of course, that never happened. And instead of that, I got 2 years hard discipline in profitability at Pentagram. And I'd never worked for anybody, so it was actually brilliant for me. The 2 years at Pentagram was like a kind of masterclass. I had the kind of self-esteem, at least, of being a partner. But I had, like a dozen of the most experienced designers of graphics and product design in the form of Ken Grange to learn from. So I had mentors that I'd never had as a youngster. But not one mentor, I had a dozen mentors. And they ranged from, Alan Fletcher to Colin Forbes, from the comical to the corporate. And I learned from them. And I didn't like what I learned. It was awful. I learned how you run a design studio. And it reassured me that I didn't want to do it. I didn't want to work like that. And it wasn't why I was doing it. So I then spent the next decade, they threw me out after 2 years because I was incorrigible. And I spent the 90s sort of adrift. I learned, Pentagram was my starter course in how you interface with grown-ups, with business. And I learned a little bit of the language, and then spent the next 10 years perfecting lying. And I did what I could, basically, to earn a living. There was the kind of the temptation of the art career all the time, but I didn't really know anything about art as a career. I didn't really know anything about art, and certainly nothing about it as a career. So I did work. It's like being a mercenary. I was like a mercenary. It was like a rebel, in the 80s, and then I became a mercenary. I became, a hired killer. And the work for Givenchy was being a mercenary. I tried to do it for causes who weren't too bad. So, I won't make an analogy there, but I tried. So Givenchy, the memory is okay. The memory of Givenchy is okay. I'm not ashamed of recrafting the identity of Givenchy, even though the true purpose behind it is shameful and there is no integrity. But I kind of thought, at least it deserves to be done well. So Hubert might, if he comes in one day with an automatic weapon, he might just not kill me. You know what I mean? If he
yes.
Yes. And that was it. And you do have to do things, unless you're an artist, and even if you're an artist, you still have to kind of live, and there's a lot of, lies there. You do actually, basically, it's work. You do have to work. And you do have to earn money, and you have to find a way to cope with that. It's easier now. This is funny now. So 10 years, there's not how many, so 2001, 2006, so 5 years. This is really interesting. Life speeds up. 5 years after Givenchy, I'm given free license by a multinational. I mean, Givenchy isn't Givenchy. Givenchy is LVMH. So it's LVMH. And this is Adidas. And it's interesting just how the world changes. So 5 years after having to, you know, tart up the Givenchy logo, Adidas say, do what you want. And the only problem is I said, I didn't want to do it. And they said, but you can do what you want. I said, but there's nothing I want to do. And this was weird. They couldn't understand that. Even Missy Elliott had something she wanted to do. And they said, why? I said, because it's rubbish. I said, I don't believe in it. I said, all of these brand partnerships, you know, Alexander McQueen and Puma, even Yohji and Adidas, they're a lie. You've got a large brand multinational with no credibility, but lots of money. And then, you know, artisans, designers, artists, whatever, image makers, whatever, who don't have that much money, or in some cases none at all, and tons of integrity. So a marriage of convenience is brokered by PR people. And they're all terribly excited. And, you know, the corporation is thrilled by the difficult new direction that this relationship has brought us. And, of course, you know, Stella McCartney or Alexander McQueen are terribly excited at reaching a wider audience and having access to, you know, manufacturing that was never... And it's rubbish. It's complete fucking rubbish. You know, one side needs the money and the other side needs the positioning. And everybody knows that now. Everybody knows that. They know it's just a kind of a convenience of business. Nobody really believes it anymore. So I said this to the people at Adidas, and they were like... They knew it's true. They don't believe it, really. I mean, they like doing it. They were nice guys. They were lovely guys. And they work in an airfield in Germany, near Nuremberg. It's really perverse. And they're literally in old sheds. And it's just meaningless. So I said, I don't really want to do it. So, because it doesn't mean anything. So, and I'm trying now to look after the one thing I have, which is a bit of credibility. Mm. And if you want to offer me like £1 million or even euros, you know, how many stripes do you want on your sport shoe? But I mean, it was 15,000 euros. So it's 10 grand. That's 1 month's overhead for me in London. It pays the rent, it pays Sam, my assistant, and, you know, the car loan and the fucking overdraft loan. And it basically, Manchester pay me 10 grand a month, and it comes in and it goes straight back out. So they pay me 10 grand, which isn't enough anyway, is it? Adidas, special edition shoe. It's limited edition of 5,000, but it's Adidas. You would think you'd get a lot more than that. And out there in the street, people think, oh yeah, Peter Saville, Adidas. Oh yeah, I bet you got a fortune for that. 10 grand. So do I want to kind of like just be another sort of kind of corporate pushover for 10 grand? Not really, but...
On the other hand,
it's
10 grand.
10 grand will be useful, and it might get the inland revenue off my back. So I said I didn't want to do it. And in fact, I was adamant about not doing it. I said, there is only, and they said, but you can do what you want. No. I said, there's only one interesting thing in this project. You're very nice, and it's been nice to come to Nuremberg, and blah, blah, blah. It's nice to see where it all started. But I said, there's only one interesting thing. And at that point, they all sat in their seats and said, what? And I said, the brief. And they'd given me this ridiculous fucking... Basically, in the brief, the truth underlying these projects was plain to see. It will be another milestone in the industry, and blah, 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 blah. And I said, this is interesting. They even told me the meaning of the word green. They said, we'd like you to use green. It is synonymous with nature, with spring. Things like this. On the page 1, they say that I am a preeminent image maker of my generation. And then page 5, they're telling me that green is synonymous with nature. And then weird things like time moves slower in a green room.
Sounds
They'd
quite
obviously
zen
been,
to me.
You know, they'd obviously been on Wikipedia for this brief. And there were spelling mistakes, all of this rubbish in there. And some great, and it was absolutely, you could do anything you wanted. And then on the last page it said, but obviously the company reserves the right to adjust the design. I said, this is interesting. And they said, how do you mean? I said, well, this is interesting. I said, I would quite like to share this with the audience because this clarifies, this brings it some enlightenment. This clarifies the world rather than adding further confusion to things. And they were like, what? I said, here's a proposition. Make me a white trainer that I would wear. You find the best quality white leather that is reasonable within the world of Adidas. Make me a white trainer. I said, I don't want any stripes and fucking logos on it or anything. Make me a white trainer, and I'm going to print the brief and put it in with the shoes. And they were like, fucking hell.
In German?
No, they're all English.
Oh, they're all English.
They're all English. They're too hip. And they did it. And they said, well, we'll consider it. And they said, we're going to try. And I was certain that it wouldn't happen. And I was certain that the last minute, some like head of marketing will say, you must be fucking mad. What are you doing? And there's a brilliant guy who works with Adidas called Gary, who's from Manchester, who works in London. And Gary said, you know, you can do lace jewels. You can print on the laces. So as well as the brief, which they made me a special wrapping paper and I put the brief on it, the highlights of the brief. And I also made laces with the brief with this rubbish on, and this stuff they called lace jewels, and all of these sorts of things. And they're all disposable, so there's also some white laces. You can just have a pair of white shoes, and there's one Adidas on it, which is injection molded on that sole. And I used the palest green that they could do. I said, you want green? Here's a nice pale green. And I accept the fact they couldn't take the Adidas off the sole because it's an injection mold across, 10 sizes or whatever, fine. But all the rest they took off. And the surface detail that is there is laser etched, which was quite nice. So, and there's no Adidas on, there's nothing. It's pretty cool. And we made all this sort of kind of fancy stuff. And it's great. I mean, there's a big plastic tag that says shoe, because that was on the front of the brief, shoe. And kids wear them with shoe. I mean, it's really fantastic. They walk around with shoe on their shoe. I was quite pleased, and I saw some kids in a shop in London, and I was looking. There was a display, and I went to just look at it because someone said, "Just check, tell us it's okay." And I'm there. And there's a couple of young guys there with like skateboards and stuff like that, and they recognised me and they came over and they said, "It's really good." He said, "About time," and they went, "Oh," and I was like, "Someone got it," and that's as best you can do, isn't it? If someone gets it.
Okay, I'm going to hopefully try and speed up a bit. 2 words I think you kind of alluded to already so far: sex and money. And I think, Peter, you've got quite a fine taste in women, and I've noticed that these are obviously 2 Roxy Music covers from the early 70s. This is a photograph you then took of Sasha in 2000, I believe, and I think this could, some nice type, bit of different lighting, could have been a sort of Roxy. Sorry?
She was hiding.
She was hiding.
I was going up the stairs and with the camera in my hand, and she was crossing the bedroom with nothing on, and she was like, "Stop it!" So we got a half Sasha, and it was really nice.
I think it's very.
Sorry.
No, it's so. These kind of women,
it's not a photo. It's not a photo shoot. It's a home picture at. It wasn't even my home. It was my friend Yvonne's home, because I didn't have a home at the time. It's Yvonne's fancy house in West London, and I was living there for a while. And Sasha hated having. She had been a model, but she hated having a picture taken, and she was hiding, or she trying to get out of the way. And it was just one of sometimes you get your prints back from wherever, and there's always something that's. Good. Yeah. Usually the accidents are the good ones, and that was a nice accident. That's not. Jarvis Cocker should have known better for that. Have you got the cover I wanted?
No, I've only got this.
Okay. There's a picture. One of the pictures that we did with John Curran that day was Steve, whatever Steve's name is, Steve Mackey, Steve, and the elderly man that we'd cast, and they're both wearing cotton polo necks. Steve, I think, has got a brown one. The elderly man has got a white one, and it looks like a funny meeting at a golf club. And it was the most John Curran-esque as a composition. It's very, very John Curran. The palette, the composition, the juxtaposition of the two figures, the whole thing was very John Curran. It's the best image of that shoot. And so it should have been the cover. And also, these two men, a young man and an elderly man, at the golf club with the phrase, "This is hardcore," I thought it was fantastic. Steve didn't. Steve thought it was just really, homoerotic in a way that he didn't wish to be portrayed. And I kind of thought, with Pulp, I thought Jarvis would overrule him. The hierarchy exists there, and I thought Jarvis would get it. And I thought that Jarvis wanting to appease John Curran, but they didn't. Jarvis actually, and this was an image I thought could be inside or underneath the disc, kind of, okay, let's get down to basics kind of feeling. And that's where it belonged. It belonged inside somewhere. What is, the kind of the uglier side of this. And they said, well, that's the one we want for the cover. And it was, Jarvis took a lot of flack for that. And the funniest thing was London Transport, who refused. There's always anecdotes with stuff like this. They refused it as a bus, the back of bus posters. They said you can this is brilliant. They said you can have "This is hardcore" on one of our buses, but not that image. Or you can have the image, but not "This is hardcore." But you cannot have that image and the phrase "This is hardcore" on a London bus, which I thought was fantastic. It's really dodgy, that image. I have nothing to defend about it. And it gets worse. Her name is, oh God, what's her name? Like Ivenia or something. She's an Eastern European model trying to kind of, have a modelling career in London in 1996. Yes.
You don't like London for its heartlessness?
No. A great term from the other day, carnivorous. It wasn't in the context of London. It was in the context, actually, of a building developer in Manchester, which somebody referred to as being carnivorous bizarreness, which I thought was fantastic. It was Fat and Will Alsop's, Fat's council housing and Will Alsop's Chips building. Somebody referred to as carnivorous bizarreness, which I thought was fantastic. But carnivorous is a great word for London now. And I liked London. I liked it as a youngster when I would, once a year we'd come to London and, do those things, go to toy shops and stuff. And in the 60s I went to Carnaby Street and got a matching flowered shirt with tie. That was terribly exciting. And when I moved to London, it was wonderful for all of those things, for kind of Burlington Arcade and Soho and everything to be in your town was brilliant. And I loved London. I kind of aspired to one day, having a home or something. And 1990 kind of ended all that for me. And here we are sort of 15, 16 years later, and not only has it hasn't got any better, but it's just got much worse. I can't bear it now. I find it really scary. Really scary. I think there's something massive going on within the sort of social economy of this country, and London is the sort of, well, London's the kind of crucible of it. It's the effect of it is spilling everywhere, but London is where the kind of, you know, this is where it's the crucible of kind of fracture.
And if London's heartless, then is Manchester going to have a heart? So, just to clarify, Peter is now the creative director of Brand Manchester, and so on the left, obviously the Guggenheim and the whole notion of the Guggenheim effect in Bilbao, and many, 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 many infinite number of cities all around the world said, you know, I want a piece of that. And does Manchester want a piece of that? And how are you involved in that?
It's too late to start on this now. We might have to have a sort of, you know, repeat tour. In a nutshell, well, no, not in a nutshell, that sounds stupid. A simple and crucial element about this is that the world economy is doing the things that the world economy does that we don't need to reiterate, and regions are facing the consequence, and regions in the Western world. So as regions in the East might be having a moment of, you know, renaissance or naissance, Western regions, you know, areas like, you know, the northwest of England and the northeast, the Ruhr, the Midwest of America, you know, Chicago, Detroit, places like that, manufacturing, all of the manufacturing places, all of the places that came into existence on the basis of manufacture, so on the basis of the history of the last 200 years, their raison d'etre has gone. They're not making things there anymore. So what's the point? You know, what is the point of Glasgow after shipbuilding? What's the point of the Ruhr after coal? What's the point of Manchester after cotton? And actually, you know, we could say there isn't a point. And apart from the fact that there are communities there and voters there, there isn't a point. And central government in, you know, the expensive new world, central government increasingly cannot afford to subsidize the regions, and certainly not in any kind of meaningful way. So the leaders of those regions, and in this instance the Council of Manchester, are having to take on the horrible, you know, reality of being business facing. Now, councils don't have a culture of that. Councils were not put there to be businesses. Councils were put there to take care of the community. That's what the council did for people. And now the councils are having to become businesses. They're having to become sort of business-facing on behalf of their communities. And this is a weird new culture for them. And one of the things that we're seeing, a kind of horrible sort of consequence of this, is this kind of nonsense of branding, of regional and urban branding, because everything's being branded these days. I don't think people really have any idea at all what they mean when they use the term, or it seems to mean something different to everyone. So regions are branding themselves as if that's going to have any significant effect on the real passage of time and social evolution. It can't. So, you know, giving Birmingham a logo isn't going to make people buy more Birmingham. It's not even appropriate. It's not, you know, I mean, you know, kind of identity and branding within the context of products is quite important. And just the management of it is important. You know, if we change the Coca-Cola, there's a Coca-Cola tin there. If we change the logotype and color of Coca-Cola tins overnight, the consumer, you know, Coca-Cola sales will plummet the next day, just on the basis couldn't find them in the shop. So, your identity is something you have to manage. We don't go home at night and cut all our hair off and sort of paint ourselves orange, because we think that will confuse everybody tomorrow. So, so the management of your identity is an important issue. But what is the identity of a city or a region? There's not a fucking great big airship floating over London with London on it, in case you don't know you're here.
Unlike the shoe that said shoe.
Yes, well, a shoe that said shoe. So these logos and of course slogans for cities, I mean, what a disaster. If you've got to have a slogan, it means nobody wants to go there. I mean, the world's successful places don't have slogans. Like the Big Apple or whatever is not a slogan, it's just a nickname, it's a term of endearment. It's not a slogan. Glasgow, miles better than what? It was obviously pretty bad. I mean, if we walk past the restaurant tonight and it sort of says whatever, I don't know, the golden cloud, better than it was. That does not make us go in. So the whole principle of it is kind of misconstrued, I believe. And actually, there's an irresponsibility on behalf of marketing and design agencies who have identified local authorities and councils as kind of victims, targets for business. You've got a lot of inexperienced people there who don't know how to buy design, and they've got tons of public money, and they want to try and throw it at a problem. So you can go in and you can charge them $500,000 for a new brand identity, and it's pointless. It's got a little bit of value, but it's not really going to change anything. So when I got asked to help with or to comment upon, my interview for the job was basically commenting upon the issue. And I said, I think what you're really talking about, or what really matters here, is a communications program out of Manchester. That's what really matters. And I said, in my opinion, do something worth talking about, and people will talk about it. That's a communications program. And half the people in the interview were like, off with his head. What do you mean, do something? And they said, what exactly do you mean? And I said, well, I'll tell you what I mean. I've been back here 2 or 3 times a year for the last 25 years, and I've seen, this last few years, I've seen a lot going on, but I'm not that impressed. So, half the interview panel wanted me to be immediately, banned from ever entering the city again. And the other people sort of, shook their heads and said, he's right. And, I couldn't believe they gave me the job, because other people went along who wanted it, wanted the job, and were, enthusiastic and gung-ho about branding Manchester. And they gave me the job. They decided that actually I was speaking not only sense, but also the truth. And that I was being genuine. And I did care. It's my home city. I cared. It hurt me when I came to London and people laughed at me. It really did. You can't believe how sort of socially divisive the UK still is, but also was. I couldn't believe it. When I went to an okay school, I could sort of speak quite well. And people I met in London just sort of, kind of this sort of, you just knew they kind of thought you were a bit of a kind of oik from the north that had fallen out of, Coronation Street. And that really hurt me. And it still hurts me when people sort of, think that, cities in the north of England are sort of, kind of cloth caps and men with ferrets down their pants or whatever it is. It's true, but it's still upsetting when people think it. So it did upset me, and also I was annoyed about it. There's a whole bunch of things that I'm annoyed about with regard to it. The UK is the 4th or 5th largest economy in the world, depending on which paper you want to read. It should be able to support another city. It really should. And London, as we said earlier, is not that great anymore. London is a really punitive experience for people now. I think it's quite reasonable to propose that the UK has another grown-up, mature, cultured, alternative city to go to instead of London. I think that's an entirely reasonable proposition. And, you know, if we were to pick up somewhere like Cologne or whatever and just park it 1 hour down the M4 or something, I think there's a lot of people in this room who would think there's a place to work. I mean, interesting, there's been so much building going on in Manchester for the last 10 years that architecture students or graduates from all over the world are going for jobs in Manchester because they're building. So it's kind of quite interesting. And I believe that, you know, Manchester is probably the most likely of any other UK city to be that other city. So, you know, it can happen, it should happen. And so I just wanted to, you know, it's, you know, kind of like national service. It's my home city. I thought, well, I will give my input on that possible future. And I was comfortable doing it because the shareholders in this instance are the people who live there. And the profit of this particular exercise is possible futures for, you know, the next generations. So that's an okay thing. That's better than helping someone sort of flog handbags. So I've not minded doing it. It's very hard work. It's very hard work. I have rooms full of people, as many as this, who have no idea at all what you're talking about. And you know the kind of defining sort of phrase of the original modern city. That's the kind of brand objective that I've come up with for Manchester. Not a slogan, but in a way a kind of a brand vision. I thought about it and I looked for a dream of Manchester, and of course it had to be based on the provenance of the city. It had to come out of reality. And by virtue of being the world's first industrial city, it was possible to call it the original modern city. And so there was a claim that you could make. But importantly, the values of originality and modernity were timeless values. So unlike first industrial, which is rooted in the past, and yes, you can open a museum, the values and the qualities of original, you know, contemporary originality are timeless values. So I went back to my client and said, look, Manchester can be called the original modern city, and so many of the kind of fundamental issues of modern times were brokered there. The Labour Party, the cooperative movement, the women's movement, you know, the first working computers, an endless long story of the kind of social and technological relevance of Manchester. And it was the first industrial city. So I said, look, it was kind of original and modern, original and contemporary thinking that formed this place in the late 18th century, 19th century. You could still be original and modern. You could be synonymous with original and modern thinking in the 21st century the same way you were in the 19th. I mean, you're not so much compared to other British regional cities. Manchester is fucking head and shoulders above, but it's not, you know, it's not a world important city as an experience yet, but it could be. So I kind of gave them a route map. That was how I went about it. And you know, the Guardian came from Manchester, and it used to be called the Manchester Guardian. I mean, lots of people in this room who have come from other parts of the world won't know that. It was the Manchester Guardian. Until the late 60s, it was the Manchester Guardian. If it was still the Manchester Guardian, what different perception people would have of Manchester. But, you know, sometimes in meetings in Manchester, I put a copy of today's Guardian on the table in front of people, and I say, when you can do this again, you're en route. And they're like, oh, shit. You know, it's difficult to imagine now, but anyway, that has been my way, and we've spent the last year or so trying to kind of inculcate this message down through all of the sectors of the city. So the areas of, you know, the cultural sector, the retail sector, the educational sector. It's still got like the second biggest university campus in Europe. It's actually, the university has got more overseas students than any other college in the UK. And I spent the last year or so being, in a way, kind of brand guru across the the sectors of activity and the representatives of activity in the city, explaining to them what original modern means, what it means to them, and pointing out the fact that it's their city. Your brand is what you're known for. That's your brand. So individually and collectively, we have a brand. Your brand is what you're known for. And I have to point out to them, it's what you do that is what the city is known for. So it's not a logo that will act as some sort of magic bullet to make everything terribly good. You define the place.
I think we're going to wrap up there. I think for me what's exciting then about this project is the way in which I think a lot of what you've done, whether it's in music or whether it's in fashion, is, and we discussed this phrase a couple of weeks ago, which was a term coined by a journalist at the New York Times, which is a notion of a kind of mass-produced secret,
which was a nice term.
Which is a very nice term, and I think the way in which you've played with codes is another kind of thing that you referred to, and the way in which you use very unobvious codes, and the way in which they then filter up, and make a kind of alchemical transformation of something that in other contexts might be considered elitist, obtuse, and so on, or irrelevant even, or marginal, and somehow manage to crash into the absolute sort of horizon of popular consciousness.
The early factory stuff is very it's very kind of wishful bourgeois. I mean, it really is. Actually, when I look at it now, I find it quite funny. But then so were obviously many others of my, generation. It's how we felt. We kind of wanted to sort of sex our lives up a bit. So it kind of, it touched other people because they kind of felt the same. And, the important thing is to realize that, that kind of life and work is actually kind of in process all of the time, and that those things change, and that, kind of it's cause and effect. So, you change things in one way, and then you have to kind of, the next thing you do has to be a response to the new scenario that you've created. That kind of, sort of bourgeois aspirationalism is something that, 25 years later, everybody's got the hang of, and is a kind of a fixation that they now need to get rid of, as quickly as possible. Recreational shopping is a disaster in certainly in the UK. I think in Kuwait it's probably all right. But recreational shopping in the UK is a nasty addiction. I mean, it's helpful at the beginning. It can give you a sense of confidence, a sense of identity. Okay, but then as a habit, it's very nasty. It's like crack.
I'm going to I think we could, as you could tell, we could literally go on for hours and hours. Before I just wrap things up, I'd like to just also thank Zach and Wayne for doing some really wonderful posters, which you may have seen at the entrance, and Sam at
I liked them.
Yeah, they're super good, and Sam at Peter Studio has been amazing. And so Peter Saville, on behalf of all of us, thank you very much for being Peter Saville this evening.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you all for coming. I'd like to remind you, in case you haven't had enough this evening, tomorrow evening is Cristiano Toraldo di Falcio from Super Studio. So that's at 6:30. Thank you.